So this is usually the toughest session of the day, I think, right after lunch. And we've got a great panel to deal with this challenge. I want to say first that I'm grateful to you, Deidre, for inviting me. And it's great to be here, always great to be here in Berkeley. I was here last year on sabbatical, working with Deidre and with Ken. So it's great to be back. And I have to say, Nicole, that for me, you are part of the Berkeley experience. So regardless of the last changes, it's good to see you here also. The title of the session has a lot in it, and I'm actually not going to try to read through it, but hopefully we'll touch all of the issues that are raised. I'll just briefly introduce the speakers. You have the bios, of course, and we have a mix of experts, legal experts, but also technologists and the social scientists who I hope will remind us that we are dealing actually with people and not just with data protection. And some of you, I think, actually combine more than one of these skills. So starting here on your left, closest to me, is James Rule. James is a researcher and a writer on privacy and a professor here at UC Berkeley. Next to James is Thejo Kote, who is a founder and chief executive officer of Automatic and is also a graduate of the iSchool here at Berkeley. And Automatic is something to, so I've actually written an article with a colleague, Jules Polonetsky of the Future Privacy Forum, calling for featureization of big data, making it a consumer-side feature, so not only the organizations, the companies, or the government can learn interesting stuff from the data, but also the users, the consumers, the individuals. And if I understand correctly, Thejo, that's exactly what Automatic is doing. Maybe you can elaborate a bit during the discussion. Next to Thejo is Tien, who is a senior staff attorney at the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Next to Lee is Seeta Gangadharan. I tried. Seeta is a senior research fellow at the Open Technology Institute, which is part of the New America Foundation. And all the way on the other side is Ari Gesher, who is an ambassador, an engineering ambassador at Palantir, which is a big data vendor. So I actually want to start talking about due process concerns for big data and for algorithms. And I want to start with a personal story. And you have to excuse me because it's kind of prosaic and mundane, and it's not very important. It doesn't have anything to do with the no-fly list or the NSA or even credit decisions or employment. But this is the story. So I was in London a few weeks ago for a conference. And I'm a customer of Citibank, so I have like a Citibank card. I went to get cash out of an ATM machine, and sure enough, it doesn't work. It doesn't let me withdraw cash. So I called the bank, and they say, okay, we're transferring you to the security and anti-fraud unit. So a person answers, and she starts asking me questions, asking me basically to identify myself. So, the standard questions, I think social security number, mother's maiden name. And, I can tell you it's not like a suspense film. I can tell you the end, like spoiler alert, the end is that it's me. It was me. so I answered the questions, correctly, I think. And then she asks me about some of the last transactions that I made on the card before I left the US. And, here this is like, I took a flight. It wasn't a direct flight, so it was like a 9-hour flight, and there's a 5-hour time zone difference, and I'm kind of jet lagged. And it's like the day before, so this was Sunday evening. She's asking me about transactions that I made on Saturday morning. And it's, it's a bit difficult. Try it yourself, right now. It was a bit difficult for me to remember, but I think I did remember. So I had to think it through a bit, but I remembered, we went to ice skating with the kids, and then we went to the supermarket, and I gave her a couple of transactions. And then she tells me, I'm sorry, I can't remove the security freeze. And I say, what do you mean? Why? It's me, I know it's me. And, I might have gotten 1 or 2 of the transactions wrong, or, maybe I missed one, but I did get most of them right. And she tells me, no, and there I am in London. I'm stuck, without access to my bank account. I have no money, so, luckily I had workarounds, but it could have been kind of a harmful situation. Why did she reach this decision? I don't know to the day. Was it the data that she inputted that was wrong? Maybe she didn't hear me, or was it the algorithm? Maybe all the data was right, but obviously there is some algorithmic decision here. I'm sure she didn't make an. Who was that?
It was not editorial.
It was me.
It was Spartacus.
So in any event, I feel kind of disempowered. Can I challenge this decision? Maybe I can't, or actually maybe I can, right? Because I'm speaking to a person. She maybe can overrule it, but why would she overrule that decision? There is an automation bias. She gets a result from a computer. Why should she believe me and not what the computer tells her? And that kind of reminds me of the Bettina Wolf story, which I'm sure many of you know. So this is the wife of the former president of Germany, who actually sued Google for defamation based on the autocomplete results that you got when you searched your name. And when people search your name, Google autocompletes the query, and it showed prostitute or escort services, stuff like that, which, is very offensive and harmful. And, what's the logic in this decision? So actually, with the Google search engine, we kind of know the logic, right? It's recursive. It's basically showing us what other people are searching for. But is it, is it true? And who would you believe if there is a challenge? Do you believe this lady, Bettina Wolf, whom, none of us know personally, or do you believe the Google algorithm, which we kind of trust every day dozens of times with other queries? So I think, there's some automation bias, and also maybe some liability issues, and just organizational issues. If she makes a decision to trust me as opposed to the kind of algorithmic result, she has to justify it to her supervisors, and I might not be me, so she might be liable for something. So it's a problem. Now, in this context, of course, the decision isn't very, doesn't impact my life greatly, although it could impose some harm. It's a bank, but it's not like a credit go, no-go decision. But in other cases, when the government is involved, then of course it also implies administrative law and constitutional law and freedom of information, and may actually impact your liberty or your life. So I want to pose the question to you, due process in situations like this with algorithmic decision-making, How can we challenge the machine? Maybe start with you, Ari.
Well, I think it's a really salient question, and it's one that becomes increasingly important as our algorithms become more and more eerie, where it actually sometimes becomes even difficult to understand how the machine made a decision. We're not quite there today. I think today, what we've learned in talking about this in the past few days with some of the leading practitioners and in our work at least is that most algorithms, you can deconstruct them and understand how they're making a decision, which is a technical question. The more sort of social policy question of whether or not you can get an answer to that and what rights you have in terms of interacting with these institutions, be them governmental or commercial, that are running these algorithms, and their need to expose it to you or their duty to expose it to you, that's a bigger question. I think it's one that hasn't been well thought through. Today, there isn't a lot of, other than for really operational considerations, like to help your data science team debug your algorithms to make sure they're doing what you want, there isn't a lot of emphasis on being able to reverse engineer how an algorithm is making a decision. And I think it's something that going forward is going to be a really important prescription to have, which is to say that any time you're using automated decision-making tools, you need to be able to address redress, to be able to say, like, hey, why were you denied use of your own ATM card, and that you should be able to ask how that decision was made and get an answer to it. And I think that's a really important thing for us to look at as we figure out what the future is of this kind of algorithm decision making.
So actually, one of the things we discussed yesterday when we chatted about this was the difference, if there is, between algorithms that are more deterministic. So it's a decision tree that you can kind of undo in retrospect and check why a decision was reached in every point in time, and algorithms which maybe are actually smarter. So the machine learning type artificial intelligence that are more like a black box. So a lot of data comes in, and and maybe there's something in the middle which is deterministic, but already so complex and like thousands of data points that are very difficult to undo, certainly with any timeliness.
Yeah, there's a certain opacity that's gonna exist there, which is that any readout of especially really heavily statistics-based algorithms are going to say, well, we made this decision because we computed this weight for this decision tree, and we made this one because we have this computed weight based on everything that we've seen in the past, which ends up being kind of opaque to a certain degree, which is to say, well, how exactly was that weight computed? You can say, well, we looked at the last 100 million email messages that came through the system with some sort of Bayesian classifier that came up with these statistics. It doesn't always adequately answer the question of exactly why do those weights exist and how
can I jump in here for a second?
Please, sure. For more than a second.
I think one of the is almost a lexically prior question is how do you even know that a decision was being made, what has been made? Yeah. I mean, a lot of the concept
that's the political
is that
side of it, absolutely.
Once you have something, your anecdote, you asked, you were denied, you knew something had happened. There are lots of decisions where the people involved and affected, either those whose data was captured or those who were the subjects of the decision, have no idea a decision even occurred. I would argue that that's the most, so that's the part of the iceberg that's sitting under the water is those myriad decisions. And one of the reasons why I think that's especially important is because we're seeing the use of these kinds of technologies and techniques in areas like government surveillance, where almost by definition, the decision about whom to surveil or how many people's data to capture is at least in one political regime held to be a secret in the first place. So no one even knows that decisions are being made, and then decisions to surveil, and no one knows why, and no one has a sense of what are the inputs that go into decisions about whom to target for surveillance, and so forth and so on. And I guess I would argue that of all the kinds of decisions we're talking about in this realm, this is the most challenging, and I won't say it's absolutely the most important, but certainly it's very important, and it's one that is the reason why we're having these discussions on big data, is because of the role of big data in that kind of surveillance operation. So, I mean, I don't know what the answers are in terms of a full-fledged due process context, but certainly the first step is notice and disclosure and transparency. You can't really make any progress if there isn't significantly more transparency about what's happening.
So maybe just to, I'll let you chime in, but just to flesh out some of the issues that have already been raised, I think we are making a distinction between a situation where the data subject or individual actually knows that a decision has been made concerning her, and assuming that it's a negative decision, otherwise, right, she probably doesn't care. So then, can she challenge it in any meaningful way, right? So this is my case, like with the Citibank. Is there anything I can do to kind of prove the algorithm wrong? And and it's obviously an uphill battle, but is it possible? And second, what do we do when I don't even know that a decision has been made? And sometimes the decision has been made based on information which isn't even my information. So I'm kind of implicated by other people's information. James.
Yeah, I amplify Lee's concerns. And I would say, if you wait in your policy response to the moment when a disaster is recognized as happening, you've already lost. As they say in my little specialty of things, studies of law and society, the process is the punishment. If you get pulled out of a line, this happened to me, a group of people re-entering their own country, you're pulled out and subjected to questioning that involves reaching inside your garments. Even if you're proved blameless or assumed blameless at the end, it's a terrible, terrible experience. We don't even know the reasons. We don't even know, as people have said, when these decisions have been results of decisions or algorithms. I sense a tension in these discussions between people who gravitate toward responses in terms of waiting for something to go wrong and then trying to find a viable means of redress, versus people, as Nicole Lolzer put it this morning, who are looking for a shield against a world in which we're vulnerable to these kinds of things. Here's my biggest obsession on this matter. Most of the talks, it seems to me, have started with the premise that we live in a world where personal data has somehow escaped permanently, like a lot of wild animals from the zoo, and we're at their mercy. And so the question is, we've got all this we're in this environment where data is flowing everywhere. Heavens to Betsy, what can we do about it? We got to find means of redress. We got to find means of accountability, transparency, blah, blah. If you're reacting after the fact like that, you're ignoring the possibility that this data environment that we're in is not a fact of nature. It's not a dictate of technology with some sort of capital T. It's a manifestation of the legal and political environment in which we live. In other environments, there is no, in most countries in Europe, there is no secondary release of personal data. In alternative environments that have been imagined for this country, there are enduring personal rights, forms of property right or copyright, that would apply to the commercialization of data about people, such that without consent, your data cannot be resold, retransmitted, reprocessed to feed, not all, but many of these processes. So that, and it's not, this is just not just my personal hobby horse. You look at the writings of Dan Solo, Paul Schwartz. They've tried to imagine legal statuses for personal information that would preclude the commercialization of merchandising of it without consent from individuals across the board. It's not a utopian idea. Europe in this way is already significantly closer to that than we are. So let's certainly talk about what can be done when disasters happen, but let's try to imagine environments in which there aren't so many disasters waiting to happen.
Okay, you know, I don't want to step too much on the turf of the other panels. With I think a couple of the previous panels, both of them actually address these issues of consent and the regulatory framework for the information collection. You know, all fair points, but we are actually concerned about the algorithm once it's there. And
I think it's a broader theme, though, which is you know, as you were saying, to head off this kind of disaster, and it really comes down to a question of accountability in many different forms, right? And so in the case of sort of data transfer and how it's moving around, it's a question of accountability and consent. But as automated decision-making becomes more pervasive, it's a question of building in accountability. And I think, you know, one of the things that's missing, you know, even in the most, you know, libertarian idealists think about the government's job is to sort of price the externalities into the market, is that there's no notion of accountability in automated decision-making, that there should be any kind of redress, that there should be any way to understand exactly how a decision was made. And so what you see is that in the design of these algorithms, of these automated decision processing systems, that's not a design consideration because there's no incentive to actually care about it. The work that we've done at Palantir we've done a lot of work on actually building accountability into all the decision making that we do, and a lot of it is by staying away from full automation to begin with. And you know, one of the things that you mentioned in your opening story was like, there's a cultural issue inside of organizations about trusting the computers, which is to say the computer says the answer is 5, therefore it's 5. Why would I ever question it? And so when we build...
Right, there wasn't full automation in this story, right? I was talking to a human being who
It was probably pretty close to full automation. She could make an exception, but her job was probably on the line if she did, right? So it's like, it'd be probably very difficult to. But there is a need for carefully tailoring the systems to get the outcome that you want. So like when we build automation into our systems, most of what we build is actually all about interactive human analysis. So giving very powerful tools to humans to move through large volumes of data. But once we get into machine-generated data sets, like when you're doing cybersecurity, you have way too much data for humans to ever deal with, even when they're being assisted. And so you have to use automation. But what we do is we very carefully apply automation to start with some very large universe of uninteresting data and winnow it down to things that are interesting and that should be queued up for human review. But we're careful in the design of those systems that anything that spits out of that filtering process, it doesn't say this is a cybersecurity problem, here's an intruder, or this is fraud, or whatever the task is at hand. Instead it just says, this is interesting in some certain ways and I don't know enough to make a decision. It's just being flagged for further review, and the job of the human analyst is to actually bring in their intuition, their expertise, and then use their interactive tools to make a final decision that then they're accountable for, right? And so, and you see this, and the reason that we've built these kind of systems, we work in places where people care deeply about these decisions, right? Locking you out of your ATM, they'll do that all day, but if it gets too high, then they're going to lose customers and they're going to care about it. When you're talking about like someone's like home equity line of credit or a business line of credit, if you start willy-nilly locking those things down with automated systems, you get a lot of really angry customers, right? And true harm that's perpetrated on people. So they want to be very careful. The organizations that use this stuff want to be very careful about making those decisions. And when we're in the government domain, we care deeply about, as technologists, being the ones who are bridging the divide and about what's possible, and saying, you should care about accountability. This is really important that all of these decisions be very carefully accountable. And so we not only make it so that you can reverse engineer how the decisions are made, but that every action that an analyst takes is very carefully tracked so that you can do full oversight, as well as having a very careful permissions regime, which makes it so it's very difficult to do abuse and to set up systems that guard against that. And that's something that we've thought really deeply about. And I think we've been surprised in the marketplace that we're the only ones who seem to be thinking about it. We're the only ones who have said, well, you can't build tools of this kind of power and complexity without considering what the impact might be and making sure that you use technology to safeguard against those abuses. And I think that's, and that comes just from our own sort of, it doesn't come from anywhere. No one told us we had to do that. That was something that we wanted to do constitutionally. But we need incentives in the marketplace, both on the government solution side as well as in the public marketplaces, to say this needs to be an important part of the design of these systems.
But do you all agree that fully automated systems that don't have this human kind of involvement in the decision-making process, A, and B, systems that are based on algorithms that are more black box nature as opposed to a deterministic model should be like banned? We shouldn't use them?
No, I don't think
Thejo.
so. So,
It's almost laughable.
No, it's, yeah, at least it is to me. And he was talking about cultural issues in companies which actually create that. And you were talking about your experience with Citibank and Palantir today is a big company, right? So I kind of bring up the perspective of a really small company, and we're about 30-odd people now, but we weren't a while ago. We were like 3 people sitting in the room building things. And I like to think of things, if you're building those black box systems, or if you're building systems which are completely automated, which, a lot of innovation and technology, new products that are built do that these days. And how do you actually think about that? Because I think that we spend a lot of time talking about accountability and how do you actually scrutinize the algorithms. That feels to me like a problem which is 2 or 3 steps down the line. Because when there are 3 people sitting in the room building these systems, I feel like you also have to ask and answer the question, are they aware of what they're doing, right? And I had the benefit of sitting in Deirdre's class and as an electrical engineer being challenged to think about issues that we would never have thought about otherwise, right? And so we kind of brought that perspective to whatever we were building. And so to me, the more interesting question is as you're building these black boxes and completely automated systems, the technicians whose values are embedded in those systems, like, you have to start thinking about them first. Maybe because these algorithms and big data and these systems are having such a big impact on society, should every computer science student have an exposure to these issues when they're learning how to program in Java or C or Python? Should this be equally important? And is that a part of the solution? And banning them is not, because I feel that the benefits that these algorithms and big data systems bring far outweigh the risks. At least that's my perspective. But the more interesting question to me is how do you address that, and how do you make sure that the people who are building those systems are actually aware of the issues and address them appropriately.
But are these positions incompatible? Because you're basically talking about embedding policy into code. But he's saying in any event, you need to have accountability mechanisms to make sure, maybe someone made a mistake out of goodwill, not bad will.
Yeah, so I'm not saying we need to embed it in the code. So what I'm saying is absolutely accountability is
I think the only difference in our positions is he's taking a slightly utopian view, which is to say, let's teach the practitioners how to do it so they care, which I think is a great thing to do. And what I'm saying is you need more than that. You need rules that make people care when they build the systems. Right?
That too, yeah.
Yeah, they need to understand the considerations, and that should be part of their education.
A lot of the experiences we see these days are, you build these systems, you screw up, there's an uproar, you backtrack, and you fix it. I'm like, how can you make that better? Right?
Yep.
Yeah, the rules are important,
yep.
But awareness is equally important to prevent those.
We should never underestimate the power of liability to make companies conform to
Well,
some kind of norm. Right?
We're the lawyers on the panel. We agree. Seeta.
Sure. I just wanted to jump in and find a way to wedge my world into this conversation. I think it's really interesting to hear about stepping back and thinking about how do we have a value system that informs how engineers develop certain kinds of products. I think it's really interesting to think about, having automated systems that are part human, part computer determined or algorithmically determined. I guess what I would like to, and I recognize that, government surveillance is part of the reason that all of us are here talking today and airing these issues. But, when I hear a discussion about automated systems and the frustration that the end user faces when confronting hard, decisions that don't support them, that they're shocked to find out. I think about the case of, in this country, especially of poor people, and poor people that have to use public benefits, are enrolled in public benefits programs, and the enormous frustration that they face when they go through the trouble of lining up, at 8 in the morning to come with their forms that has information about them, to then be put into the system by a caseworker who then, does the, input, and then what comes out of that is a decision about whether or not that person is eligible in a particular public benefits program, and if it's a determination of ineligibility, there is very little that that person can do. So, I guess what I would love to hear from somebody like you, or even Thejo, who's thinking about this from the earlier, at an earlier stage in the development of technological systems, how can the conversations that you're having actually inform a different context where we're talking about, real survival?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a really great piece that was written by by a man named Jake Solomon, who just finished his fellowship at Code for America about this kind of process design. In this kind of, I actually think of this as a user experience problem, which is if you're designing a system of benefits to benefit a certain group of people that need help, you should design it to actually help them rather than be some Kafka-esque maze that they have to try to navigate, and they need to have a permanent mailing address to get the notice of what, like there's a lot to be improved there, and I think a lot of that has to do with, is less about, I think that one piece where they put in the information, it spits out ineligibility, that's a minor piece of a larger problem there, which has to do with not having this sort of human-centered design for the problem that you're actually trying to solve.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Jim wrote the book, Private Lives in Public Surveillance, that was all about the way that data is captured and collected and used in eligibility benefit systems as well as punishment systems. And I think the real point is when we're talking about algorithms as though they're a new form of opacity, and they are a new form of opacity, but the basic problem of opacity is extremely old, and the bureaucracy has always been an extremely opaque machine. And that's why, I picked the easy case of, or I think conceptually easy case of government surveillance because A, it's clear that we don't know what the decisions are or when they're being taken, and at the same time, it's clear that the government is subject to very specific constitutional norms of due process. We don't have to ask the question of, gee, should a corporation be subject to due process? It's already clear the U.S. government is supposed to be. And the only question is, how do we make it work? And if you can't do it with the due process constraint, then you actually can give the correct constitutional answer, which is that you shouldn't do it at all if you can't do it the right way. So the question becomes, what are the ways in which you can design that process, design this socio-technical system, which is not just the algorithm, but everything about it, around it, to comport with those rules.
When Kafka wrote the trial, it wasn't about algorithms, right? It was about human decision-making that was still completely opaque and puzzling. James, you wanted to respond?
There is always a human issue in these systems. It's technocratic to imagine, as you might imagine, hearing Thejo and Avi, talking about these systems as though they were aimed at justice, that is, avoiding mistakes. What constitutes a mistake? The basic thing about decision-making of the kind that we're supposed to be focusing on is the following. Efficiency is not the same as justice. Things that are successful, appropriate decisions for the system may be utterly unjust and inappropriate for individuals. In the insurance industry, I was recently reading, somebody has found an algorithm that identifies customers who call to inquire about their coverage. How much is my deductible if I apply for payment for some damage to my house? Insurance companies don't want to deal with people like that. They don't want to deal with people who even think about making claims. It's not just that they don't want to deal with people who make claims. We know that. They don't want to deal with people who are having that thought. Okay, well, all right, so what's a just and proper algorithm? What's a just and efficient algorithm? An efficient algorithm is to make note of all those inquiries and make sure that those policies don't renew. Is that justice?
So I want to explore this transparency versus opacity issue a bit more. And obviously, there's a big asymmetry when we talk about the big data world between the transparency of individuals, you know, in the David Brin sense of the transparent society, and the, you know, apparently Kafka aside, increasingly opaque nature of the bureaucracies, whether they are governmental or business. And, you know, on the one hand, the organizations want more and more data about us, and they also argue that it's good for us. It's good for our national security, it's good for our cybersecurity, it's good for our improving our shopping habits. We'll buy better stuff, that we actually want more. On the other hand, we cannot know, you know, anything or much of anything about them. So if it's the NSA or the TSA, it's classified, and if it's businesses, it's a trade secret, and it's the secret sauce. And, you know, the framework that appears to win the day, at least in the privacy context, is accountability, which in a sense means trust us. Like, we'll, you know, we have the, we'll collect the data, we're past that, it's a use-based system, and trust us because we'll be accountable and we'll kind of get it right within the organization. And then, you know, when the evidence comes out, sometimes it's kind of damning. So, you know, the President's Review group says that the entire NSA database was used to avert maybe, you know, just a couple. I think the P Club said not even one case of terrorism. Google flu trends, there was just an article recently in Science or Nature, one of these magazines, saying that they get it wrong like 100 out of 108 times. You know, I'm just wondering if there needs to be transparency of the inner workings of the machine, of the algorithm. What kind of transparency do you envisage? Vis-a-vis whom? Like, do you let consumers look at the algorithm? You know, we could hardly deal with privacy notices. The algorithms, of course, will mean nothing to us. And there are significant concerns about national security and trade secrets. So what does transparency mean in this context? Who wants it?
Well, I mean, I think...
Lee.
I mean, so I've been thinking a bit about this, and I think we talked a bit about it yesterday as well, which is that I think that releasing the details of algorithms isn't practical. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with it, but that A, they may not be completely scrutable to the public in the first place. B, there may be significant resistance either from sources and methods defense from the government or from trade secrets and IP from private institutions. But I do think the kind of transparency that you can shed on these algorithms, the kind of light that you can shed on it, has to do with characterizing their behavior. Rather than giving away the details and the machinations of their inner workings, is decide the ways in which you want to measure their behavior and the ways in which you care about, the kind of harms you want to protect against, and come up with a set of measures about how they perform and measure them over time, and make that something that is published, make that something that is actually completely transparent, to say, you know, here is the demographic distribution of the decisions that are made on credit scores or whatever it is, so that you can characterize the behavior in a way against some sort of social good or some right that you're trying to protect. And that you can do without publishing the details of the algorithms, and it still gives the companies the freedom to sort of secretly innovate and apply their special sauce, but still be held to some accountable standard of behavior, which I think is the thing that we all really care about.
Yeah, and I can give you a very concrete example of what Ari mentioned, because that's exactly what we do. And, you know, with Automatic, just 30-second background is that we tell you a lot more about your car, and your car is the most expensive computer you own, and if you own a car in the US, you're spending $8,000 to $10,000 a year on that car, and most consumers don't know anything about it, and you're spending just $3,000 a year on gas, right? And so one of the things we do is give people a lot more insight about exactly how they drive, and we give them feedback on if you change your style of driving in small ways, you can save up to a third of the money you spend on gas. Of course, the question becomes, of course, we score users and we give them real-time feedback, and then there is a lot of interest around, why are you giving me a low score? How does this work? How does that work, right? And so and we explain to our users that these are specific things that you are doing. This is how our algorithm works. We don't want to give out that equation and numbers because it's just too much. But here are the high-level inputs that go into how we score you, right? If you're speeding on the highway, that has an impact on fuel efficiency. If you're braking really hard, if you're accelerating really hard, these are the kinds of things that go into that score at the end of the day. And of course, people do want to challenge the laws of physics, and they still don't get it. And that's an interesting conversation. But at the end of the day, you will always have a small percentage of your user base that's really passionate about what you're doing, and you could think of it as them keeping you honest. And so yes, you don't want to go ahead and describe in detail exactly what's happening in the system, because most of the time it's just not useful, right? And so he's perfectly right that talking about the nature of that system and how it works is really helpful, and it does improve that transparency.
So I would have to say that on the government side of things, we would have to approach it very differently. I mean, I think that first of all, there's so many more legal/constitutional/democratic accountability constraints with respect to what the government does that one would have to look at a much more aggressive level of transparency and accountability for any kind of decision making, especially that which relies on any kind of automated factors. But I still think that right now that the role of the people in making those decisions is probably a hell of a lot more important than the role of the software. That it's still a very, very heavy human role in those kinds of surveillance decisions or other kinds of eligibility and benefit. And I think that we also want to, I think on the government side, we can sort of get away from the concern about competitive disadvantage because you are not worried about rivals understanding how it is that you do something. What you are concerned about is whether or not your citizenry, the public, that has, in theory, the ultimate decision about whether or not you do it at all, has enough information to make that choice. And if they don't have enough information to make that choice, then you know you have fallen short. So all of that ends up sort of pointing an analyst, I think, into saying that you have to confront the entire system of classification, at least at the U.S. government level, to try to understand how can we bring it into alignment with the requirements of democratic accountability. And that's not just sort of at a principled level of like, gee, what should the rules be? But understanding that there are tremendous institutional incentives for secrecy, tremendous institutional incentives that have existed for many years for not talking about this stuff, because if nobody knows what you're doing, then no one can complain about it, right? It's kind of like Jim's question about who is going to actually think about making a claim.
Can I take it out of the government context for a second, just to make it easier? It's not much easier, but so the target pregnancy score. So they have some algorithm. It's great. It identifies exactly the week of pregnancy a woman is in. What do you want them to make transparent and to whom? Yeah.
Well, these analytical questions, including the one that you've just articulated, and ones that others have been saluting, are questions that ordinary people are not, in the course of their lives as consumers and citizens, often well equipped to drop what they're doing and address. But in case we've forgotten, this country is one of the very few liberal democracies in the world that does not have a national data protection and privacy commissioner. And that is exactly the role that these offices do discharge. They look underneath the hood in cases where there seems to be systematic injustice in the application of the uses of personal data. They respond to apparent violations of people's dignity in the pregnancy case or loss of other interests. And they have the resources, they should have, and in many European countries they do, to actually challenge the organizations, both of the state and private sector, that are engaged in these activities.
I have to say that a couple of professors here at Berkeley Deidre Mulligan and Ken Bamberger have an article about privacy on the books and on the ground, which kind of disputes, the actual reality of that situation. And the law, it's certainly like that, but I'm not sure how robust the enforcement is in practice. But Seeta, you wanted to weigh in.
I just wanted to add what I think might be a different angle on this conversation, and maybe actually consistent with how Ari got us thinking about human-centered design. So, this question about transparency and asymmetry, I think, really requires us to think about the kinds of institutions that we need and the kinds of practices that we need to encourage in a professional context or otherwise that can help us grapple with these questions about is the algorithm or are the algorithms that are being used reliable and getting us what we need to get as citizens or as consumers. And I don't really think that we've gotten there yet. I mean, in the days that I've been here, it's been really encouraging to hear that there's a privacy professional organization that really tries to grapple with some very, very difficult questions. But I don't think from the perspective of the communities that I deal with that we feel that we see any support system that is currently strong enough to help us grapple with the kinds of inconsistencies or surprises or frustrations that we might confront when targets us for a particular type of product. So all of that is to say that while it's important to think about accountability mechanisms that can be put in place within government institutions or within corporations themselves, I think that there needs to be a complementary set of practices put into place that allows us as a society to understand algorithms more generally. So we heard earlier in some of the first conversation here, some talk about literacy and understanding and knowledge. And I think algorithmic literacy or data literacy is something that we shouldn't just set aside as an insignificant point of policy discussion, that actually that could help us contribute or create a culture where we're able to maybe not determine that this algorithm is reliable, but certainly know who to turn to when we have a problem as an individual. I don't think that these end user solutions are, sufficient, but if we have a culture of support, as was said earlier, if we have some social support system that can help us navigate through these worlds, we might be better off. And I don't think that that's necessarily been part of how many of us have thought about these questions.
So I want to
just throw out. I mean, one of the people often diss public disclosure of stuff because they most consumers won't read it, most consumers don't see it. But the fact is, the nice thing about public disclosure is that it's out there so that anyone can. And there are regulators who will benefit from being able to see stuff that is publicly disclosed. There are organizations that will be self-appointed watchdogs. And the fact that if it is publicly disclosed, then they will be able to see it. I mean, this is the whole point of, when you look at the environmental movement or other movements in the past, there have been special interest groups and associations that will be able to proxy for the interests of those who are not formally represented. These kinds of public, transparent data mechanisms are of use for them as well. So if we throw away, if we say, well, we don't have to do public disclosure, we're also starving them of oxygen too.
Well, I think one of the things that we've been hearing is that there's sort of like an ecosystem of solutions that we can advocate for. I mean, I certainly don't want to do away with disclosure, because I know that as we have more and more of these conversations, there are going to be watchdogs that are stepping up to the plate to help us deconstruct some of these problems. And at the same time,
it's just not the single solution.
It's just not the single solution.
Yeah, and I think in the data security community, sort of fortifying an algorithm by making it public and letting the research community, have a crack at it is really the standard. But I wanted to ask in this respect, whether outsourcing transactions and a lot of these data machines are actually collaborations, right, between the private sector and the public sector, is an impediment to this kind of transparency, maybe a way actually to subvert freedom of information or actually constitutional protections. So the delegation of rulemaking or decision-making to private actors being an impediment to the kind of accountability you're talking about. Maybe Lee and then...
Well, we certainly have always, the state action doctrine has always been an attempt to try to capture some of that. Its current doctrinal state is probably insufficient for a regime of continual routinized public-private partnership, but it's at least recognizable. You can make an argument. We did make an argument that when AT&T was helping the NSA, that they were a state actor and then their actions were actually subject to the Fourth Amendment. You can make those kinds of arguments, whether there are other kinds of contexts where it may be more difficult to do that. But it's not an insurmountable problem. It certainly is a concern that there will be end running, but that's all the more reason why the notion of due process, and we see, like in Daniel Citron's work, the idea of technological due process operating as a norm outside of the government realm, the more that those kinds of accountability concepts can be built into the private sector, the less of a regulatory arbitrage problem you'll see from that.
Ari, are private vendors subject to the Fourth Amendment?
Well, I think they should be. I mean, they're not, and I think that a lot of that has to do with the inability of regulation to keep up with the pace of technology. I mean, if you look at the way, that we live in this sort of bizarro world where an email on a third-party server is subject to Fourth Amendment protections for 6 months as long as it hasn't been opened, right? And that's because the law was written in 1986 when the state-of-the-art email might have been like.
He's taking notes. Yeah.
I'm going to answer that.
But the point being that we need sort of a reimagined notion of personal privacy for a distributed world, right? When all of the existing case law, I think, hangs on the notion of sort of being secure in your person and your papers in your home, there isn't this notion of Gmail, right? And we need a way to sort of reimagine that for the modern world, which is to say that our data is all around us and it's ours and we want it to be private and it's in many different places. And that the current problems with the arbitrage relate to the fact that just we don't have regulation that recognizes this as private data because of the deeply antiquated notions of what privacy means. And this connects actually to, I think, a much larger theme in the world today, which is just that technology seems to be moving faster than human institutions can keep up. I mean, I recently participated in a debate about whether or not tech is creating or destroying jobs, and the only conclusion that we can come to is that maybe one day we'll hit some sort of utopia with a whole new set of categories, whole new categories of jobs that people can have, but there's going to be a period of 2 or 3 human generations where there's this sort of lag between the people who have been automated out of jobs, right, and those that are across that digital divide and know how to use the computers. And I think this is a real era of disruption, and I don't mean it in the Silicon Valley sense. I mean in the fact that we've built these machines of incredible power, and we're just kind of figuring out how they can change the established order of things. And it's actually not all that different than what happened in the Industrial Revolution. This is not in the early days of the Industrial Revolution when all kinds of crazy things were happening as people figured out what to do with steam power, which is not my way of trying to paper it over and say that we should ignore it. Only just that this is, I think, the defining problem of our age, which is how do we, when we have technology that's moving faster than we can keep up with it, how do we redefine all of our human institutions and update our values in a way that are maybe more abstract. I mean, if you look from a more concrete perspective, you look at the way that the laws around how information and digital systems are handled, they're very rooted in whatever era they were written in. It's all about, well, this is the way people are using these things today, so let's write laws that are very concretely targeted to that. And I think we actually need much more abstract policy prescriptions that are about, that really are sort of abstract spirit of what we're trying to preserve, and then they can be applied on a case-by-case basis to whatever is happening this week or next week. Because
So,
it's changing
Seeta,
so fast.
I wanna talk about a more abstract concept which we didn't kind of dive into yet, and it's the issue of equality and discrimination and the effect of these systems on those notions. You know, the machine is portrayed as more neutral and less prone to bias than individuals, than humans. But of course, we know that the machine is coded by humans, and I think, Thejo, you suggested that we need to kind of be careful about what the parts of the values of the coders actually find their way into the algorithms. I think with humans, at least you know at the end of the day who you're dealing with, who you dealt with. You know the identity of the judge and you can appeal. Here, many times it's less transparent. And I want to ask a couple of questions about this. I'll just tell you shortly and then maybe expand a bit. So first of all, talk about whether technology is actually exacerbating inequality, and then query whether there's any way to cleanse, to purify the algorithms of bias. So let's start with the first question, and I think here, and Seeta, we spoke about this yesterday, that the somber and disturbing reality is that technology, we thought of the internet as being like the great equalizer and bring information and data for all, and now we find that it might actually exacerbate inequality and, provide a forceful tool for the strong to kind of impoverish the weak. And in a way, maybe we should have known that, because technology is just another tool, and people who have more resources will have more control and ability to utilize it. But how do we deal with this?
It's a great question, and I think one that we need to spend more time thinking through, not just on this panel, but in a broader setting, in an ongoing national conversation about these issues. So first I want to say that, so I have studied for the past few years kind of this exact tension that Omer is describing. So looking at, within the context of efforts to bridge the digital divide, where there's all of this positivity about access to technology and becoming part of civic life and engaging in e-commerce and doing all of these great things to connect with friends and family. And thinking about that in relation to a type of digital inclusion over which people might not have control. So whether that's the fact that metadata from their cell phones is collected by the government, or the fact that they walk through their neighborhoods and there are surveillance cameras all over the place, or that when they log on to their email, most likely at a public library because they don't have their own PC at home, or maybe a smartphone, that when they log on to their email, they're being targeted with ads for check your credit or other kinds of products. In these contexts, I mean, we have this situation where, on the one hand, we're telling our most historically marginalized communities, come online, become part of this digital world, and yet there are so many unanswered questions about how our personal information is being collected, who is using it, to what effect, and when is that going to come back and haunt us? And so there's a real problem, and there's a real threat of entrenching existing inequalities, as you've said, or as you've started us off with. I think of it in terms of how Oscar Gandy wrote about this more than, 20 years ago, but thinking about this idea of cumulative disadvantage, that the more that we depend on these automated systems, which are premised on social sorting, that the more that we entrench existing stereotypes, existing problems, existing ways of differentiating between people. And I don't think there's an easy solution to that. I will say, to be very clear, the answer isn't let's not get people engaged with technology. Let's encourage exclusion. Certainly in the communities that I've worked with and worked in, people are very enthusiastic about technology. They want to actually benefit from the new tools that are available. They actually do want good deals. They want some degree of targeting. That's not really the issue. The issue is to what extent do we have control over these technologies, or a way of intervening in how they define us? Because if we don't have that control, then we're just at their mercy, and we're still in this cycle that we've been in, especially for poor communities, that we've been in for decades, if not hundreds of years. So, so there's excitement. There's a lot of trepidation. The other thing that I will say, that there's a lot of, frustration with the lack of support and tools that can help people navigate these worlds. So, I don't think, I do, again, think that some degree of supporting these institutions with whom poor communities interface on a regular basis is a very important consideration. But it's not the only consideration. The ways in which people get frustrated with technology is very palpable and very consequential, and there isn't often the time to do something about it in the way that an average consumer might deal with it. So I'm looking forward to hearing
your solution,
what Ari has
so we can
as
move
a
on.
solution.
Well, this is an idea I've been thinking about for a long time, and I think it was first posed to me by someone from the French tax authority, which was saying that Google is doing this great job of extracting value out of France, right? Because they get all the ad revenue, but everybody uses Google. And so what do you do about this? And it really made me think about not just about how Google is using their own data that they get as a primary holder, but when we're talking about notions of secondary uses of data, there's a runaway market that no one knows about what's going on here. And I think a very, very simple solution is actually to tax data transfer.
Say that again.
Tax data transfer. Right. So if I give you my information in the form of emails or something, we'll pick on Google, right? If I have my emails there, that's fine. I've decided to give you that information. You can use it for the stated purpose. But if you want to sell it to some third party to use it for some other purpose, that should be taxable.
Does that imply that one should be able to opt out of having one's data sold?
That's a separate question.
But maybe perhaps important.
But let's say yes, you could. But the taxation thing, what it does is it slows down the explosion in the marketplace, and it gives you revenue to regulate these things, right? And so it's kind of a 1-2 punch on these things.
I don't even know how to address this. This is like, I didn't think about this one. James, you want to chime in on inequality?
It must be a good idea then, Ari.
I think it would be a marvelous thing if people had, all of us, everybody, a residual right of some kind, copyright, property, some version of these things, in the commercial exploitation of data about ourselves. On the ethical grounds that the value of these data arises from our own lives, and we are the authors of our own lives.
But Julie Cohen wrote, I think 15 years ago, about the propertization of personal data. And she actually predicted that doing just this, making personal data a property right, will further victimize the poor. And, it's the marketplace.
Can I give you an example of
It's just worse for you.
So I was speaking with somebody that was talking about augmented reality and thinking about personal data lockers. And the example that this individual gave me as to how this could be potentially empowering, which sent shivers down my back, was, well, if people had their own personal data lockers, say Nike wanted to come in and use your personal data for whatever reason, they could do that, and it would all be under consent and so forth. And I'm thinking, like, if you're going into a poor community and you're Nike or whatever company, and you're saying, like, hey, can I use your data for a while and I'll pay you $200 or some small value like that? I mean, who's to say what the long-term consequences of that?
Yeah.
Who's to say what are the long-term consequences of the road which we're now racing down?
Well, but I think the point is that people will take not only $200, but 20 cents usually, and just sell it off without, considering the long-term
Or for nothing,
consequences.
or
Well,
for
right
services.
now,
I mean,
it's for
today
nothing.
it's the free business model, right?
Right.
Yeah, it is.
And the thing that one more small point on my crazy idea, which is that personal control of data is an important topic, but I think it is a bit of a rat hole of a lot of different issues. But once you start collecting data together, you've actually created a commons. And it's taxing that abuse of the commons that has a real moral authority in terms of applying that sort of taxation.
Can you tell me how that's going to help poor people that are in a cycle of disadvantage?
Well, so yeah, absolutely, which is to say that if they're being disadvantaged by biased algorithms or biased decision making, we say, well, how do you do that? Well, how do you deal with that harm? Well, you regulate it in some way. Well, how do you pay for that regulation, right? And so the idea here is by taxing data transfer, you actually create revenue from the people who are causing the problems in the first place. You're extracting value from the people who are stealing value from this commons in the first place by figuring out business models on top of this data and using that to enforce regulation about fair decision making and due process and non-biased algorithms.
For the second time, I'm not going to engage with the taxation model. French tax authority, not regarding. Discrimination. So obviously, discrimination in algorithms or in this algorithmic society is a big concern because some of it can be, obvious and blatant if, like, the criteria that you put into the algorithm take account of race, for example. But many times, and I think Cynthia and Deidre made this point in a couple of articles, there are so many proxies and mirrors. And actually, this is like one of the neat things about big data, that you can find all of these interesting correlations that you wouldn't even think about that can mask the discrimination. So, you won't use race, but you will use a preference for a sneaker brand, or maybe stuff that you don't even know. How can you cleanse algorithms of discrimination? And I guess this raises the question of whether we are trying to protect against discriminatory intent or discriminatory effect. Lee, or Thejo, you want to start?
Yeah. My view on that is you can't, right? I think maybe you can prevent intent, discriminatory intent, but the impact is what it's going to be because you can never predict what's going to happen. And that's the, at least in the area that I work in and the data that we see, it's a completely new field, right? And a lot of this is greenfield, and you go and do things and you analyze things in ways that haven't been done before.
Can you give an example?
So one of the things you talked about was insurance, right? And so when it comes to your cars and automotive insurance, it's a huge industry, but they still use your age, your gender, and your marital status to figure out if you're a good driver, right? So there are proxy variables that have nothing to do with how you actually drive a car, right? So now the big question is, okay, now you know exactly how you drive a car. Is that predictive in trying to figure out who's a good risk and who's not, and which variables are and which ones are not? Right? And that's a completely open question today. And the last big variable that industry figured out works well was your credit score, right? Your financial credit score is somehow a good indicator of whether you're a good driver or not. So when you now can look at actual driving behavior, how do you figure out what variables, when it comes to your actual driving, are predictive? And as you're investigating that, could you end up discriminating against certain types of people? And we talked about this yesterday about, it is known, the data shows that if you drive, after midnight between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m. or something like that, you're a bigger risk. What if you are, among a class of people who you have to drive for work at that time, right? Is that discriminatory? Is that okay to use that data point? And so, when there are areas of the use of big data which you're just encountering for the first time, that's when you learn. So your intent when you use that data shouldn't be to discriminate, but I don't see how you will completely avoid, inadvertent impact. And then, of course, you have to learn from it and you fix it and you go do it, but I don't think you can completely avoid it.
I don't think we have to choose, right, between, we don't have to say, oh, it can only be X, it can only be Y. I mean, if we have a concept of discrimination that's broad enough or sort of sort of it's contested enough concept that which I think it is in the law, where we're always oscillating between these two poles of intent and impact, then it seems like the right answer is let's look at both. And one of the dangers of relying on an intent model and ignoring impact or effects is that it's like a moral heat sink of some sort. You don't have to look at effect and impact. You just can, as long as you weren't trying to do something bad, it doesn't matter what kind of bad you do. And I think that's insane. I mean, you have to be thinking about both, and you have to ask questions about both. You might choose to say that one form is more insidious and invidious than the other. You might say the remedies are different, but I cannot see a case for simply making a categorical judgment that we don't care about X, we only care about Y. I think the right way, especially when we don't know how these things are working, and we do know that it's very difficult we believe we know that in the machine learning context, it will be difficult to figure out what kind of intent was going on, that we have to actually, I think we might have to say we can't figure out intent. We can only look at impact, or we have to weight that analysis. But I think that the right answer has to be an approach that is Catholic enough to take into account all of the values that we might want to protect and not to segment out anything that might be relevant. It'll take, it may take time, but that's sort of what, the law is good at taking time.
But how do you know when to disqualify the impact? So assumingly you check, and I think, Cynthia, you suggested this, you check the result, the group that you get against the general population, and you see if it...
That wouldn't be my first choice.
Okay.
That would not be my first choice.
Yeah, you want to maybe say something about this?
I would rather design something so that the impact is guaranteed to be equitable a priori. So I'd rather build it to be correct rather than check it.
In retrospect.
Yeah.
Well, I think you have to.
Well, we had this discussion yesterday about trying to decide who is similar to whom, or how similar people should be viewed for this particular classification task, or deciding how much to charge them for insurance and things like that.
Well, I think you end up having to do both, because the only way to tell that you've designed it correctly is to measure it, right? And I think
there are theorems.
Right.
Sometimes there are theorems.
So I think that, though, that you got to start with some framework.
All I said is it wouldn't be my first choice.
Totally agree. But I think the entrance into a solution here starts with measurement, right? It starts with some objective measure against some set of harms that you care about, that you can characterize the behavior of an algorithm. And we talked a bit about this yesterday. They're sort of bringing in red teams, or almost like outside auditors, who can characterize the behavior of a decision-making system against different classes of people or different classes of harm that you're looking to guard against. It's only there, and the interesting thing about it is it actually deals with both intent and impact. Intent, you can imagine if there's evil intent, it's taking place in secret. But if you can measure it, you can actually see it. You can say, well, and then you can ask, why is this outcome happening? Is it an accident or intentional on the statistics, or is someone putting in a hidden race parameter or something like that?
So you put the data into like a big pot. I envision it like a big pot, and you mix it, and it spits out a result, and it says that white men between the age of 17 and 21 are gonna get like the higher insurance premiums.
Right.
Obviously
that's step one.
It's a group. It's not the general population.
But now that you have a fact, which is like this is the ways in which the algorithm is making its decision, then you can ask the next question, which is, why is this happening? Is it actually correct and not harmful based on the data and exactly what it is we're deciding about? Or is it a mistake? Is it some second order effect that we didn't see that is discrimination in the algorithm that we need to fix? But without measuring it, you can't even ask the question whether or not it's being discriminatory or not.
And what if it's, sorry, just to follow up on this, what if the group is of black men?
Right.
And, there wasn't any bias going into this, but this is the group. It's like, what do you do now?
Well, I mean, I think you have to go then do root cause analysis to figure out why that's the outcome that you're getting. Is it a problem with the design of the algorithm? Is it correct decision making on the basis of whatever it is that you're working on? Like you're trying to market something and there's an affinity to that group? Great, then your algorithm's working correctly. I don't know that a particular outcome is necessarily harmful, but it might be. And until you can characterize it, you can't go ask the question, why is it happening? And once you can ask that question, and this is like the route to like doing any kind of policy making here is like, people may design these things into these biases in their algorithms by accident. And you have to give them a chance to recognize it and remedy it without them knowing a priori that it was going to happen in the first place.
Jim, yeah.
Here's a completely different approach to the privacy issues involved in these kinds of decision making. 10 or 15 years ago in France, an auto insurance company, British owned it turned out, proposed a special auto insurance policy directed especially at young drivers, in which case there would be mechanisms, a crude version of the ones that you've developed, installed in every car that would actually record things like whether people are going too fast for their, for the legal limit and other basic direct manifestations of law-abiding driving. The CNIL, the French Personal Data Protection Commission, blocked that innovation, not on the grounds that it wouldn't be just, but on the grounds that it simply reached too far into intimate private life. Now, everybody who does this kind of stuff that we all seem to do has to ask this question. Are there some systems of surveillance and decision-making that are perhaps very veridical, highly accurate, but which go too far, whatever we mean by that? And that's a much more difficult question even than some of the others we've been talking about.
I agree that's a very difficult question, right? Because when we talk about discrimination, I don't know if that's black and white. It's what is discrimination? When 50% of the market is subsidizing the auto insurance prices for the other 50% of the market because there isn't good enough data, and there are lots of people who simply can't afford insurance, and they drive around unsafely on the roads without insurance. What is discrimination?
So social
if you can
policy
actually
decision.
use data and they can show that they're a safe driver and they can afford insurance and hence make the road safer, are they being discriminated against? Like, those are not easy questions.
Although then we are pushed to the David Diggers type of world of run to give up your data in order to distinguish yourself from the masses. And that kind of creates, a race to the something, bottom or top. And like a market for lemons, anyone who doesn't give up their data is already considered a risk. Should we take questions?
Yes.
Yeah. You have? Yeah? Nick. So maybe there in the middle.
So the panel so far has looked at the negative harms that can come from the algorithmic use of data. When a human looks at data, even if no consequence comes out of it, we often see that as a violation of privacy. Is when data has already been collected and is stored in a computer, and a computer then runs an algorithm on it, but no effect happens in the real world, is a violation of privacy happening?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there is a kind of, I find a paradox here, because like Google's argument with respect to the Gmail monitoring of the content of email is, look, it's not human, it's machine automated, therefore no invasion of privacy. Here, you seem to be implying that it's not good, that it's machine automated, we have to have some humans looking at it, so is that, yeah?
Well, I mean, bringing humans into it definitely brings in human bias. I mean, there's no question of that, but, that's...
But also a privacy invasion.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and there, at least in terms of system design, the way that we address those sorts of things is by having very careful controls, which only show humans the data they need to make decisions and can censor out the things that they don't need to see. It's a whole other area of design about minimization inside a system, about the access that people have to data. You can imagine, though, that even... no matter what the context, at some point, even given like an NSA workflow, at some point, if you see that there's a problem, you want a person to go look at it, and you've gotten past the point where you're worried about, let's call it casual privacy violations, where it's risen to some threshold where it's important that someone actually look at it, and the privacy considerations have been passed. You want to stay away from that for as long as possible, right? And the interesting question, though, about privacy violations, it really depends on who you ask. I mean, it's been amazing to me to see some of the terminology or the legal definitions used by the government about what collection means. That collection actually means a person looking at it, which has led us to great answers like we haven't collected anything wittingly because a person hasn't looked at it. If there's no effect in the world, though, it's hard to say that there'd be a privacy violation. I mean, the only real question would be is if a computer looks at it and that ends up changing the coefficient on a weight in a statistical model. I don't know if it's violated someone's privacy, but it still had an effect.
Well, I mean, I would certainly argue in a government context. And again, I always go to the government context. This is the easiest one. There are actual rules there. They may not be followed, but there are actual rules. I mean, if the government wasn't supposed to have that information and it has it, I don't care whether it looked at it or not. That's still a violation of privacy. Period. End of story. Because if it has it, it could do something with it, and that's implicit in the constitutional structure. And so I think it doesn't matter whether it's a machine or not. I mean, this whole machine versus person thing is, I think, in many cases, very, very much of a convenient red herring. The government did it. If the government did it, then it doesn't really matter whether it did it with the machine or not.
Cynthia, you had a question?
I'd like to go back to the first thing that James said during this panel. He said that we act as if personal data have escaped and we're at their mercy. And I think this was a really, really interesting direction that I wish the panel had followed up on. So somehow or other turn this into a question, maybe related to Paul's comment yesterday about how what we're really talking about is power. So why is it that we're just resigned to the fact that, oh, well, industry has these data and they're going to use them and there's nothing we can't change that basic fact. So please try to respond to what James said earlier.
Tax them. I mean, that's that actually takes I mean, this goes back to that loss of power has to do with not knowing how the data is moving, and once it becomes a taxable event, suddenly you actually have transparency into what's happening. You have to report it, or you're violating the tax code, which has been an incredible instrument of power for the government for a long time, as well as sort of understanding the way that the data is moving.
You are implying put the data genie back in the bottle? It's like reversing science and history?
No,
it's like Superman.
No. Suppose we said all data that have been generated to this point are a lost cause. Those are lost souls. There is nothing we can do about it. But let's think about what happens moving forward. Do we have to act as if the ways in which things are currently being done are mandatory, that we don't have another choice about how data can be used, whether or not we can control them? There's an economic power here. There's also security, blah, 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 another arm of power. But let's just look at the economic one. This is what I think is driving this kind of attitude of there's nothing we can do about it because the really, really powerful companies are invested so much in the status quo. And I'd like the panel to comment on this.
I'll certainly say that, at EFF, we have always asked and sought for data destruction. I mean, if you age out data, you will reduce that pile out there. This has not been a popular position with industry. It has not been a popular position with the government. But it's one that we have long proselytized for and will continue to. I mean, the idea that this data is going to lose its value. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Part of big data seems to be promising that, don't worry, it may never lose its value. You have even better reasons, or at least better rhetoric for keeping it than you did before. But, fundamentally, I thought what he said was sort of almost so uncontroversial that I wasn't going to comment on it, because, yeah, big data is good for industry. Big data is good for government. Both of those sectors are very, very interested, have a lot of incentives to gather information about us. It's highly asymmetrical. That's a difficult political position for us to be in. But do we think that it could be or should be better than that? Yes.
The lady in the back. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. So one through line that I feel like we've been dancing around all day and that we don't, but it's a very bright line for me that I'd like to hear your thoughts on, is profit motives. So we were talking about, giving whoever's collecting data a chance to realize that their algorithm is flawed and then come back and address it. But Cynthia made a great point yesterday that if you are a business, ultimately you're looking at trying to find ways to price discriminate. So you're trying to discriminate in the broader sense, and you will do it to the extent that it's possible. So I don't believe that an insurance company is ever going to sit there, unless the government makes them, and be like, oh, we're accidentally discriminating against low-income black people. That's never going to happen, because why would they unless that's outlawed? And so to me, that's a very bright line between our reason for existence is extracting rents versus our reason for existing is purely nonprofit public health research, or our reason for existing, like Seeta's example, is a government program that's trying to sign people up to get them benefits. And that seems like they shouldn't be lumped in together, and those should be fundamentally approached in a different way, where we know that there's going to be bad discriminatory outcomes off the bat unless we do something about it up front.
Seeta?
I think the two questions are quite connected. I think those are really, really important questions. And when, I go out into the field and I talk to people, there's certainly a sense of powerlessness, right? That we can't actually change that situation. Nobody is asking us whether or not we want to divulge this information or we want to participate in this, very quickly changing technological environment where we often don't have a choice but to give up our information. And I don't think I necessarily have a good answer as to how to confront that extremely large challenge, but it's very palpable especially for poor communities of color, where they've been in this situation before, where they have no choice but to follow what's happening and just comply. So I think it's a really important point to bring up, but I don't necessarily know how do we best challenge those practices, short of, having a very frank conversation about it with those stakeholders in the room, talking with people that, would like to see a different reality unfold.
I think that there's this need for the new, as I mentioned before, a new conception of privacy that limits the use of this data. And the one place that we actually have some example of this is HIPAA. And there are reasons to criticize HIPAA in certain ways, but it's done a very good job of making medical data not just move around willy-nilly. And it's brought sort of real remedies into the market, or liability towards the people that need to be HIPAA certified about carefully handling that data and being careful how it's handled. There are all kinds of arguments to make about how it paralyzes the health marketplace in other ways, but there should be some kind of middle road. But we have an effective model for saying, no, this data has to be protected. It's not your data, even though it's gone to the doctor. It's owned by the patient.
But there is no private right of action in HIPAA, so you can't sue. So you sign off on all of these, on the acknowledgement of all these things that can happen to your data without your consent when you go to the doctor's office. And if they screw up on that, you have to wait for the Justice Department to sue on your behalf. So good luck with that.
Last question? No? Okay, so on those final words, I want to thank the panel and thank you for listening.